Hi everyone, this is Candidate Master Isaac Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network, and for today's video I wanted to discuss a game I just played in the Pittsburgh Chess League. It was the final round. Our team, the University of Pittsburgh, was in second place, playing the alumni of Carnegie Mellon University, and the winner would ultimately go on to clinch the Pittsburgh Chess League title. And so, me having the white pieces is really important that I do well, play a strong game, and try to press for some sort of advantage, so in that way, I get to call the shots as the match goes on. It was really important that I get a result. So this is the position I had, after the opening setup. We kind of have like this weird knight to b3 Marozzi kind of line, and my opponent's now putting pressure on c4. And I thought that this was a really critical moment during the game, and I encourage all of you guys to pause your videos and try to figure out here, what would you do if you were white? Okay, well, if you haven't figured it out, I definitely encourage you to pause your videos. In order to really understand, in order to be able to find this move, you have to really understand the difference between statics and dynamics. And if you thought maybe knight to d2 was a good move here, the problem is after knight to d2, after knight to d2, black, it will just play a move like bishop to e6, and while knight to d5 might seem fine at first, white wants to play moves like f4 and open up some of the dark squares, but it's really hard to do that without a bishop on e3, and in order to get the bishop on e3, you have to play h3, you have to get the knight on g2 out of the way. It's actually a really convoluted mess, and black, surprisingly, is better in a lot of these positions. So knight to d2 would have gotten me into a slightly worse position, and black would have been very happy with the resulting game. And as my mouse slip showed earlier, the only way to get out of this position, I think, was some sort of opportunity, was this move c5. And the idea behind the c5 move is to block this diagonal, this g1 to a7 diagonal. And so if we look at the most critical line, obviously, which is to take this free pawn, what black's just done is he's given me this potential to play f4 without exposing myself to a check. And, I calculated various lines with knight to g4, and I don't want to get too watered down in them, but I thought the more accurate might be a move like knight to d7, and now after a move like e5, knight to e8, I now have full compensation for the pawn. This e7 pawn is really weak. I mean, obviously, there were some other sidelines that probably worked out better for my opponent, and if you're playing a position like this, you probably don't care that much that you're up a pawn. After a move like maybe bishop to e3 or something, I'm just positionally better. Rook to d1 also looks really strong. I have ideas of e6. So this is a really dangerous position for black. So I thought maybe, okay, well, perhaps the best idea is to go knight to c6, but already I have full control over the center, and before he gets to play knight to d7, I could just grab back my pawn, and some of these lines knight to c5, and there's no queen to b6 because bishop to e3, I've fully developed my entire army. So I was relatively happy if he were to take. So I think my opponent, he made a good in-between move, which was this bishop to e6, and according to the engine, this next move that I played was my only inaccuracy of the whole game, so that was relatively encouraging. What I should have done was, instead of keeping this tension on c5 and d6, was just to take. Because what I failed to realize was that queen takes d6 is just simply not possible because of f4, right? With the simple idea of a pin. And so when black plays e takes d6, even though the computer evaluation is even, from my point of view, this d6 pawn gives me a great opportunity to try to play for a win. All I have to do is just make sure I don't get skewered on c4 from the bishop, and I'm doing just fine. My move, I thought during the game was, the best move, knight to d5, because, okay, it stops black's threat, it puts pressure on e7, and after we trade once, I now have a lot of pressure and a space advantage. But this next idea that black misses, and the only reason why he wasn't able to get some slight advantage when he plays bishop to f5, is if he had just played this idea that we call, a bishop pendulum, and played bishop to g4 first, the idea is to provoke f3 and now play bishop to f5. We have a slightly different position where my g2 bishop is blocked. And now it's going to be a little bit more advantageous for black. In fact, white's not even supposed to play f3. He's supposed to play queen to c2 and hold relative balance. But already this position's kind of awkward. So I think if my opponent had played this, it would have been a much more interesting game. But I think it's definitely playable for white. That being said, after bishop to f5, the rest of the game stays about equal all the way until the end, when time trouble becomes a factor. So here, I think it's really tempting to want to take this pawn on d6, but if I do that, then I'll have an Isolani on d5, and it's not so clear, not to mention bishop to d3 is a threat. So first I decided to resolve this with rook to d1, and my opponent decided to take the bait on c5. I honestly think if he was going to take this pawn, now's the time to do it, because it looks like I almost have no development, and my justification is going to have to be through active play. So first I played bishop to f4, so now the queen is stuck, protecting this e5 pawn, and my immediate threat is knight takes c5, regaining the pawn, getting an active lead in development after bishop takes e5. So he plays b6. And it's important to note here this idea here of d6 doesn't work. For example, after e takes d6, bishop takes a8, rook takes a8, I actually have to start thinking about playing bishop takes knight because bishop to g4 is a really big threat. And if bishop takes f4, bishop to f6, I don't really want to play g4. I have a lot of weak light squares. My opponent, even though he gave up the exchange, has a lot more pawns on the queen side, and he has a bishop pair. This is losing. So this is not a potential option for me. And so I chose the more direct way to attack, which is this move rook to e1. The idea being that now, because this knight is pinned, he has to play this move f6. And my compensation is that I've blocked off his g7 bishop, his knight on e5 can't move, and even though I'm down a pawn, my pawn on d5 is actually kind of annoying because this f6 move actually creates a hole on e6, which is useful later in the game. So here I played the move knight to d2, and the idea here is that I either want to go to c4 or to f3 and undermine this knight on e5. Honestly, during this point in the game, my thought was if I can take on e5, win the pawn on e5, I'll have a weakness on e7, and we'll probably have a roughly equal endgame that I can maybe try to outplay, but have very few risks. My opponent played b5, taking away the c4 square. His idea is that if I play knight to f3, bishop to g4 can be annoying in some of these lines, even if I take on e5. So I decided to not play knight to f3 and instead decide a more active route. And at this point, I want you to pay attention to how natural the moves are. We had about 20 minutes each at this point in the game, where on move 18, we need to make move 30 to make the next time control. And my moves are actually very natural. I played a4 here. So obviously my threat is a takes b5, a takes b5, and with the rook attacked on a8, now I can play d6 and the rook will be hanging. So my opponent realized this and played rook on a to b8. I took once, and then I infiltrated rook to a6. This is a very natural move to play. If my opponent does nothing, I have rook on e to a1, and I can quickly get some sort of initiative, and the computer evaluation here is equal, meaning that it's very dangerous right now for black. If the computer is saying like it's equal, but one side is down in material, that means that there's a lot of room to mess up. And my opponent did just that. He played g5, thinking that the threat of rook on e to a1 was so strong. And by doing this, he ruins his structure. Bishop takes e5, f takes e5. And here it was a matter of which piece do I put on e4 to blockade the e5 pawn. I decided the bishop, making sure that the pawn on d5 was protected, giving me a chance to regroup. He played queen to d7. Notice if he moves the bishop to like d7, I have ideas of like queen to h5, and my opponent's in a little bit of a mess. So he plays queen to d7. But the problem with queen to d7 is it leaves c5 and g5 unprotected. So queen to e3, bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes d5. And here I think I can take either pawn, but I decided to take on g5 because it gave me more chances to win. And this was the right decision because after rook on f7, rook to a7, my opponent is in severe time trouble. Now it's really important. I mentioned this in my last post. Time trouble for your opponent is not time trouble for you. So I deliberately forced myself to spend a minute every move. From here on out, every single move that my opponent makes is a mistake. And it's not necessarily because of time trouble, it's because he's nervous, he's anxious, right? So he played the move c4 because he didn't realize after rook takes e7, there's no rook trade because knight to f6. So rook takes e7, knight to f6 wins the queen. So my opponent played queen to c6 to get out of the threat, but this gives me e5, rook takes e5 because the pin on g7. And here my opponent messes up with queen to g6. Okay, think for another minute, rook takes b5, and immediately, my opponent's rated about 20-50, immediately, not even letting the delay run off. He plays queen takes g5 and loses the game to rook takes b8. Wow. So just by spending a minute on every move, there was a remarkable difference between this game and the end of my last game that I posted last Friday on chesssummit.com. But I would like to point out that even though this position is very complicated, I did some analysis afterwards, and unfortunately for black, in order to try to win this b2 pawn, he has to move his king to a square like h8. And already I have ideas like rook to c5. And I did some analysis here. Queen to d7 runs into the idea of like rook to d5, so this isn't really advisable. So queen to a6, right? All right, well, queen to d5 is coming. And now if my opponent tries to simplify, this is always going to be a worse ending because now this b5 pawn is really weak and his structure is falling, not to mention this rook on f7 is hanging. A move like rook to d7 runs into rook takes b5. So if rook takes, knight takes, he's got to worry about like these rook to e8 ideas. Obviously, if rook takes knight, he loses, so rook takes rook. So this is not exactly what my opponent wants. And a move like rook to f8, he's just going to lose material on b5. So he falls apart completely here. It's actually really important to realize like how much of a factor moving this king away from the center of the board is. So I thought this was a really instructive game. And if we go back, it's all because of this move c5. And if I had played it correctly and played c takes d6, it could have been an even stronger advantage. But from this point on in the game, every single move had to be forcing or else I had more. So bishop to f4, attacking the knight. It doesn't exactly force anything, but it makes my opponent, have to worry a little bit. Okay, he plays b6 because of the threat on on c5. Okay, rook to e1, he has to play f6. All right, knight to d2. Knight to c4 is unpleasant, so he feels compelled to play b5. I think I agree with him. a4. Okay, he has to get his rook out of the way. Takes. Okay, it's important that he can't play rook takes. Not because of rook takes a6, but because knight to c4 is extremely powerful. There's almost nothing that he can do in that position. This is just lost. So he has to play a takes b5. All right, well, my move is really natural. Rook to a6. I'm threatening moves like rook to c6, which is really annoying, followed by bishop takes e5. And it's not quite clear what my opponent should do. He plays g5, and all of a sudden his position just falls apart. And now, with my pawn on d5, maybe my knight can reroute to e6 if he doesn't take the d5 pawn. He has to take. And after taking on g5, my opponent just falls apart like a house of cards. So one thing that's really important when you're playing is always consider the static and dynamic factors. And in this case, my opponent just simply wasn't up to the task of holding the extra pawn convincingly. And after g5, I think I was just playing for a win. So I thought this was a really instructive game. I was really nervous the whole time, to be honest, because if I mess up and we lose, it could cost us the league title. Fortunately, we wound up winning 3-1. So the University of Pittsburgh, for the second year in a row, has claimed the Pittsburgh Chess League title. And I'm really looking forward to my next tournament, which is next Saturday, the G29 Chess Championships. So make sure to keep in touch on my blog, chesssummit.com. I'll probably write something on either a candidates tournament again, or on the Altibox Norway chess tournament, because the Grandelius win, the first round win over Jan Ludwig Hemmer, that was a really instructive exchange sacrifice. And I thought that would be something worth sharing. So, I'm still undecided about what I want to post on next week while I'm waiting for my games to happen over the weekend, but make sure to check out chesssummit.com on Tuesday and Friday. This is Isaac Steincamp signing off from the Chess Summit Network, wishing you a great weekend.